drained from his head or was pushed in with sudden pressure, but his vision swirled and darkled and his face got hot. Dark mode? Fuck that shit. Before he could really think about it, Bran's burst of ire had caused him to fly through the sanctuary doors, slamming them on their stoppers. Despite the fact that every one of the hybrids in that room could probably kill Bran with their bare hands, he might as well have been Khan himself, the way they all jumped and then froze, staring at him like thieves caught in the act. But Bran didn't look at anybody but Kat. She was standing in the middle of all of them. They'd pushed the pews back to give themselves a wide area to work. It looked like it had been Shad and a bed that had been toweling because they were crouching across from each other, chests still heaving with exertion. Kat stared at him. Interestingly, and also infuriatingly, she didn't seem to give a shit that he was standing there. All the others were goggling like they were in big trouble, but Kat just looked at him like he was a minor nuisance for interrupting. "The fuck is this, Kat?" Bran demanded. Kat frowned like she thought he was stupid for having to ask.
"Training. To fight."
Bran took a step further into the room. "No, you're not training them to fight, Kat. You're training them to go dark mode." Oh boy, he was getting hotter with every word that came spitting out of his mouth. "Unfucking acceptable!" Kat crossed her arms over her chest and regarded him with that defiant look of hers.
"They need to know how to—"
Bran cut her off with a raised hand. Then he pointed to the others. "Boys, go check on Shay. Make sure she's all right. And when do you get on watch? No one's on watch." Kat glowered.
"You're supposed to be on watch."
Bran stalked towards her as the others rapidly unasked the room. Bran doubted they were afraid of him, per se. Probably more terrified that he'd tattle on them to Shay. Which he wouldn't, but neither would he tolerate this bullshit from Kat. "Well, I was gonna go on watch," Bran growled at her. "But then I heard my dear friend telling a bunch of impressionable boys to go dark mode." They do not need to learn that shit." It was only by monumental effort that Bran kept himself from shouting, and only so Shay wouldn't overhear. "Christ, Kat! Back in the valley, what was it that we promised each other?" Some of the defiance left Kat's eyes. They dropped down, looking just a mite chastened.
"No more dark mode."
"No more fucking dark mode," Bran concurred. "You think you're fucking slick, sneaking in here to train those boys behind Shay's back, but you're not. And you know what? I wasn't even gonna stop you, Kat. Not until I heard that bullshit come out of your mouth. Is that what you want? You want to go back to how you were in the valley? Did you like that aspect of yourself?" Kat looked at him again, some steel coming back to her gaze.
"No, but I like surviving."
"You don't need to act like an animal to survive."
"Against Khan? You do."
"Dark mode," Bran began, but then stopped himself. Damn it, but he hated that stupid name. It always struck him as so silly. When he'd coined the term, it had been meant as a joke. But that was before he'd realized that what he was doing to his soul wasn't humorous at all. And by then, the name had stuck. He took a few slow breaths with his eyes closed, and when he felt a little more in control, he opened them and looked steadily at his friend. "Kat, I don't know if you really understand. Maybe that's my fault. Or maybe it's no one's fault. Maybe it's just how you're wired. I don't know. But let's cut through the crap cake, huh? Let's say the truth to each other once and for all." Kat frowned like she didn't know what he was talking about. Bran leaned in, his voice lowering. "We were murderers. Do you understand that? We didn't just kill people, we murdered them. Do you know what the difference is?" Kat drew her head back.
"No difference. Killing is killing."
Bran almost screamed at her. Sometimes her denseness almost seemed willful. How could she be so smart and so fucking ignorant at the same time? He took a big, steadying breath, letting the boiled-over pot of his anger simmer down just a bit. Then he shook his head. "No, Kat, there is a difference. Killing can be justified. Sometimes you got a good reason to kill. But murder is never justified. And that's what we did, Kat. You and me and all those people in the valley, we didn't just kill them, we murdered them. Because what we did to them can never be justified. We weren't defending ourselves. We just... His tone became acidic and bitter. Went dark mode. Kat looked put out, like it was Bran that was being the willfully ignorant one.
Human bullshit,
she said petulantly.
Killing is killing. Doesn't matter how it's done.
Did she really not see the difference? Was her mind truly so simplistic that she couldn't see the nuance between killing to save yourself or someone you loved and killing because you got pissed and wanted to kill? It made all those bad memories come surging back to him, and not just what he'd done in the valley, because Bran had been a murderer long before that. He'd never been caught for it. It wasn't what he'd spent time in prison for, but that didn't change what he was. What he'd been and was trying hard to be no longer. An angry, thoughtless man that lashed out at others and took their lives just so he could feel like something in his chaotic life was in his control. He lowered his gaze. Now that he was thinking of his own guilt, could he really be that pissed at Kat? He found his anger cooling into shame. He stared at the space between their feet. I never told you about the first time I killed someone. A glance upwards that fell short of eye contact, then back to the ground again. Murdered someone. Kat's feet shifted slightly.
No.
That sound, that damned sound, still so clear in his memory. The sound of a whiskey bottle hitting a skull, the glass not breaking like he'd thought, instead breaking the bone, ruining the brain inside. I was out with some friends, Bran began haltingly. I was 17. And this was back before everything went to shit. Back before the plague and primals and hybrids. We were drunk. And high. He paused, not sure Kat knew what high meant, but deciding not to get into it. He could still see the glow of that firelight. They were all too young, and the city they lived in was too small and too close-knit to get away with teenage shenanigans inside the city limits, so they'd always drive out into the nearby countryside where they could hide in some farmer's vast field away from prying eyes. I was an angry young man, Bran said quietly. My father had died a couple years prior, and everything in my life felt like it was spinning out of control. Being angry made me feel like I had control. If I was just pissed enough and mean enough, then people respected me. Or at least that's what I thought. Really, they were just scared. But that gave me a sense of power. Like if I just stayed mean, I could keep a grip on things. Bran sighed heavily. So I was out with my friends, and they were all scared of me. Except for this one guy. This one fucking asshole that didn't know me like they knew me. He hadn't seen how pissed I could get. He thought I was just acting hard. Once we all got real drunk, he started in on me. Kept pushing my buttons, trying to get a rise out of me. I guess to see what I'd do. At first, I just let it go. But I was starting to boil inside. And this guy, he figured I was just all talk, that I had everyone scared for no good reason. And that... Bran paused again, raising his head, but still not looking at Kat, looking off to the side. It offended me. Who was this asshole? And how dare he challenge me when he didn't even know me? Who the fuck did he think he was? And if he really thought I was just acting, maybe I'd show him why everyone had a good damn reason to be scared of me. He was all in my face at that point, laughing and yelling and shoving and trying to get the others to laugh at me. Making a joke of it, making a joke of me. And I was just sitting there with a bottle of whiskey in my hand that one of us had stolen from their old man. And I waited until he was leaning into me. Bran could picture the guy's face as clear as day, face flushed with derisive laughter, lips red and glistening, wet with beer and liquor. Then I grabbed the whiskey bottle by the neck and I swung it at his head as hard as I could. In my mind, I thought it'd shatter, maybe knock the asshole back a bit, maybe even knock him out for a few seconds, show him what it meant to piss me off. Bran snorted without humor. Show him how tough and mean and scary I really was. He stood there in silence for a moment, slowly shaking his head back and forth. But the bottle didn't break, and it was still mostly full, heavy. It didn't break, but his skull did. I heard it. I heard the crunch of his skull shattering, and the guy dropped, and I stood over him, and I remember having this dim sense that I'd seriously fucked up, but I was just so angry. I was out of my mind. So I just stood over him while he lay there on the ground, twitching, and I knew he must have had brain damage by the way he was seizing up. But I just spat on him, acted like I didn't fucking care. Another long silence. Bran breathed, his chest feeling hollow and raw. I killed him. And once I realized what I'd done, I told the others that I'd kill them too if they said anything about this. And we cooked up a story about how the guy had been drunk and fallen down and hit his head on a rock. We took him to the hospital after that, but he was already dead. And no one ever found out the truth. My friends never told anyone what really happened. Finally, he did look at Kat. Because they were scared of me. Because I went to some place in my mind where I was so angry that I didn't think about what I was doing. And in that place, I wanted him dead. That's the truth. I'd wanted to kill him. And that's all dark mode is, Kat. It didn't make me stronger or tougher or more in control. I was out of control. I was just raging. And what I'd done wasn't just killing. It was murder. Do you see the difference? Kat's scrunched-up face told him that she still didn't quite grasp it.
But
she began.
We have to fight Khan to survive. Killing him is not murder.
No, it's not. It's self-defense. And that's what would make it a necessary killing instead of a murder. But I'm not going to let you teach those boys to fight without thinking. You want to teach them some tricks that'll help them be better fighters? Better able to defend themselves and their home and their mother? Fine. I won't stop you. I actually agree with you. They do need to know how to fight to defend themselves. What they don't need to learn is to lose their goddamn minds and fly off into a rage every time violence is on the table. Because bad shit happens in that place. You hurt people you didn't intend to hurt. You kill people that don't need to be killed. Maybe it's absolutely necessary to kill Khan. You'll get no argument from me on that point. But dark mode? That just makes you a fucking animal, Kat. It turned me into a fucking animal. And that's the fucking problem. Do you get that? You teach them that shit. All you're doing is teaching them how to stuff down their human side and act like the animals everyone thinks they are. And you're better than that. And so are they. You need to fight, then fight. But don't turn into the beast that everyone fears you are. After pouring out his heart like that, Bran would have really liked to see Kat connect the dots and give him some sign that she understood what he was saying. He was disappointed when she snapped her head up distractedly and stared at the door to the monastery. Bran kind of had a hard time not going dark mode right there. Kat, he seethed. Did you hear anything I just... Shh, she hissed, raising a hand in front of his face. A spark of anger at that dismissal, but then cold fear as he saw the way she was staring out the sanctuary door and the way she inclined her ear to it, hearing something he could not hear. Then she whispered,
Car's coming.
Chapter 16. Patrick had almost rode bitch on the lead pickup in their convoy, simply because it seemed like the best way to be the first to get his sights on an infected. But as the vehicle trundled its way along the overgrown gravel road to the old monastery, low-hanging branches scraped the top of the cab, and he heard the guy that had rode bitch cursing as he ducked to avoid them. And then Patrick was pretty glad he decided to sit in the front passenger seat. His window was open, and he kept the muzzle of his lever action nestled in the crook of the side view mirror. He'd reloaded as many rounds as he could, but his supplies were getting low, so he only had 17 of the big 45-70 cartridges, including the ones already loaded in his rifle. His eyes dipped from their constant scanning of the woods all around them and took a glance at the side view mirror. The reflection there showed him the 4 other vehicles in the convoy, snaking their way along behind Patrick's. It was okay that he didn't have much ammunition, because he had 24 people with him and all of them were armed and loaded for bear. 5 vehicles total, 3 from O'Brien, 3 from Winchuck. This was a joint operation between the 2 settlements. Patrick hadn't wasted any time the previous night. He still could hardly believe that he'd made it out of those woods alive. Had almost been shocked when he'd seen the headlights of the vehicle he'd called in for backup, and the second that they'd driven him back to Winchuck, because that's where they'd come from, Patrick had got on the base station radio and put out the call. After explaining the situation to a half-dozen different people over that radio, and in person when it came to the Winchuck folks, it became evident that Patrick wasn't the only person that was highly perturbed at the thought of some assholes in the woods raising and protecting infected and human hybrids. Hell, he hadn't even known such a thing was possible. The infected seemed so alien, so inhuman. It boggled the mind that they could even procreate with regular humans. And dear God, who the hell was doing that? What human in their right mind was fucking these beasts? Maybe he shouldn't have been surprised. People were disgusting, and selfish, and short-sighted. Did they not see that their entire species was backed into a corner now? They couldn't compete with the infected. The infected were a pestilence upon the world, and the only solution was total extermination. He'd thought this was common sense, but apparently some folks had no common sense. Again, he shouldn't have been surprised. Hadn't he always quipped to his daughters that common sense was not so common? The thought of his daughters, now 3 years dead at the hands or claws of Big Black, made his finger quest down to his pants pocket, feeling the comforting outline of that little Coke bottle cap, his lucky charm. Up ahead, white adobe walls began to glimmer through the greenery. Patrick let go of the bottle cap and put both hands on his rifle. He kept waiting to feel nervous, as he should have felt going into any situation dealing with infected, but he found that he wasn't, at least not nervous about dying or being hurt. He recognized that those were always distinct possibilities, but he was frankly just so pissed at those 2 people, the man named Bran and the woman named Shay, that it blotted out any fear he might have felt for his own safety. What he did feel was just a small, discomfited stirring of his conscience, because what was he going to do if they didn't give those hybrids up? Patrick had no qualms whatsoever with icing those beasts. He felt no more emotion about it than you might feel in chucking a bug bomb into a house to get rid of an infestation of cockroaches. But what if the 2 humans decided to fight him over it? They were clearly insane, but they were also humans, and they had helped him last night. They'd given him shelter when he'd begged for it. They'd given him water. They'd tried to help his busted knee, which was still busted, but he could work through the pain. And how had he repaid them? By pointing a gun at them, by taking the woman hostage. He still felt bad about pistol whipping her, and he wondered for the umpteenth time since he'd done it whether she'd survived the blow to her head. Part of him hoped that she had, but then he worried that if she'd survived yesterday, she'd give him grief today. No, he really had no desire to hurt those people. But he was going to exterminate those hybrids, and if the crazy humans that were sheltering them got in the way, well, that was their problem. Patrick's leading pickup broke through the tree line and into the open. Seeing the monastery in the daylight shocked him afresh. How the hell had they missed a compound this big sitting right between their 2 settlements? But as big as the compound was, it was probably only about 5 acres or so total, and that wasn't all that big when you thought about the thousands upon thousands of acres of Oregon wilderness it sat in. "Stop here," Patrick ordered, his voice thick and tense. The driver hit the brakes and brought them to a halt right there in the middle, staring straight into the open entrance to the monastery. Patrick thrust a hand out his window and motioned the other vehicles to take up positions to the right and left, creating a firing line. Then he got out. Behind him, doors slammed as the other fighters that had most rabidly volunteered for this operation got out and took positions. Patrick glanced back and saw that they were doing what he'd instructed them to do, maintaining a 360-degree perimeter. Didn't want any of those hybrid bastards sneaking up on their asses. Looking back at the monastery, Patrick could see into the central courtyard that looked like it had been converted to a vegetable garden. Outside of the square walls of the monastery, there were food plots, some recently harvested corn, and a large pumpkin patch with several green and orange growths peeking through their broad leaves. All was quiet, no movement visible inside of the monastery or outside of it. He waited for a few beats, wondering if their presence had even been detected by the residents of the monastery. Surely it had. Which meant what? That they were hiding? Or perhaps planning an escape? Or a counterattack? Patrick held his rifle with his right hand and cupped his left around his mouth. "Bran!" he shouted as loud as he could. "Shay! Come on out! We need to talk!" Bran stood at the door to the sanctuary, peeking out. The sanctuary was positioned on the western side of the monastery. The door faced south, but it only faced the adobe wall of the compound, just to the right of the main entrance. Peering out, Bran could get just enough of an angle to see through the main entrance, where he spotted a dull red pickup truck and a man standing near the passenger side door. But Kat had told him that she'd heard multiple vehicles, and as he listened to their approach, he thought she was right, though he didn't really know how many were out there. The man he could see was not Patrick, and Bran was pretty sure it had been Patrick that had just hollered at them, telling Bran and Shay to come out so that they could talk. He turned to look behind him. Shay sat on one of the pews closest to the stage. Jacob huddled next to her, Shay's arms wrapped protectively around him. Shad, Mish, and Abed were standing close by her. Nearer to Bran, Kat and Elijah stood, nostrils flaring as they scented the air coming through the cracked door. When Bran made eye contact with Shay, she shook her head. "I'm not doing anything that asshole says." Bran ground his teeth together. "If we don't talk to him, he's just going to come in here after us." His eyes slid to Kat. "Can you tell how many there are out there?" Kat took a small step forward and lifted her head a bit, continuing to scent the air. Then she shook her head.
"Several."
"Several? How many is several?" She shrugged.
"More than a few."
Bran swore under his breath at the useless information. He already knew there were more than a few out there, and he assumed they all had guns. He needed to know how many were out there because that would determine what their options were. If there were just a handful, Bran and Kat and the boys might be able to fend them off. If Shay would tolerate the use of violence to do it. Otherwise, Bran might need to come up with another plan, like slipping out the north end of the monastery and fleeing into the woods, if Shay could tolerate the abandonment of the life she'd worked so hard to build. God, why did everything always have to be so complicated? For once in his fucking life, Bran wished he could just have things simple. You had things simple, he told himself with a distinct note of melancholy, because his life at the monastery for the last couple weeks, before Elijah had been shot by the asshole outside and before Khan had come sniffing around again, had been beautifully simple, and that was all Bran had ever wanted. Simple, quiet, left alone. Bran huffed irritably. "Could you tell how many vehicles there were?"
5 or 6,
Kat said. Bran swore again. That wasn't a friendly number to him. He highly doubted that Patrick, who was clearly on the warpath, had chosen to drive out here with 5 or 6 vehicles only partially loaded. No, if he'd taken 5 or 6 vehicles, then Bran had to assume those vehicles had an ass in every seat, and all of them armed. Which was far more than Bran believed they could handle. A few sessions of Kat teaching the boys how to go for the throat did not even their odds against 24 armed attackers. "Bran! Shay!" Patrick's voice lilted to them from outside the monastery, losing none of its ire despite the distance that muted it. "You come out right now and talk to me, or we're just gonna start shooting!" Bran didn't know how much those bullets would penetrate the adobe walls of the compound, wished he knew what they were made of on the inside. But no matter the protection offered by the walls, he really didn't want bullets to start flying before he figured out what the hell he needed to do to get them all out of there safely. He made an executive decision and thrust his face out the door, bellowing as loud as he could, "Don't shoot! Give me a minute!" He didn't wait for Patrick's response to that, though he could hear the man yammering on about something as he ducked back into the sanctuary. He turned to the others. "Shay, we need to seriously consider getting the fuck out of here. Her eyes widened.
And go where?
Anywhere but here.
Think about what you're saying.
I am thinking about what I'm saying, Bran snarled back. Are you? Because you can hold on to this place and die, or you can let it go and live. I'd recommend living. Shay stood up suddenly.
Where are we gonna go, Bran?
She demanded again.
We slip out the back, they'll just chase after us. You heard Patrick last night. He's a hunter. It's his job to track things. You think he won't be able to track us through the woods? And we have no place to go. We'll just be on the run with no destination, no safety, no food, no water.
She ran out of breath, looking flustered.
We fight,
Elijah announced. Shad, Mish, and Abed straightened a bit at this, looking eager. Jacob just sat on the pew, looking somewhat bewildered.
No,
Shay snapped, slicing her hand through the air as though to behead the idea.
We're not fucking fighting them.
Elijah whirled on her.
But you're not going to fight,
Shay shouted at him.
You're not going to prove to those people outside that you're nothing more than animals. What do you think I've been trying to teach you this whole time? I've been trying to teach you how to act like humans so that you don't have to hide for the rest of your lives.
The boys, Elijah all the way down to Jacob, looked shamefaced, but Kat just let out a snort. All eyes turned to her. Kat was looking at Shay, looking at the woman like she wasn't seeing something obvious that the rest of them already knew.
We're not humans,
Kat said.
We're hybrids.
Silence. And in that silence, a look on Shay's face that Bran couldn't quite place. It was like she'd only just now realized what they were, these beings that surrounded her, that she'd cared for and tried to teach and train to act like humans, to act like something they were not. Because they were not humans, and nor were they primals. They were a little bit of each. They were somewhere in between, and they deserved to be treated like what they were, not what anyone else thought they should be, whether fear made them think they were only animals or love made them think they could be fully human. But of course, none of that solved the problem at hand. Humans or no, hybrids or no, it didn't matter. They couldn't fight and expect to win. Not when they had no weapons themselves, only 6 sets of claws and teeth against who knew how many guns. And Shay had a point, too. There was no place for them to escape to. If they ran, they'd only be chased down. Maybe they'd survive for a day or two, maybe more, but they'd eventually be found, if not by Patrick, then by whatever people they came across in the future, and Bran highly doubted those hypothetical people would be any more merciful towards the hybrids than the people outside their walls at that moment. They couldn't fight, they couldn't run, and hiding had already gone out the window, which meant there was only one thing left to do, perhaps the thing that Bran was worst at. Well, Bran said, pushing the sanctuary door open, maybe we can talk this out. Chapter 17. Hold your fire! Bran shouted, both hands cupped around his mouth. I'm coming out! Don't shoot! He stood just to the right of the monastery's arched entrance. Again, wondering if those walls would stop bullets, he listened for a response, pouring sweat that wasn't entirely due to the baking sun. Mumbles. That's all he could hear, and a few sharply hissed commands. Bran's mind filled in the blanks and figured Patrick was doing what Bran would have done, setting up a few people on Overwatch to plug him if things went south. How could Bran keep things from going that way? Great question, and he had no answer. He was not the world's best communicator. Actually, that was being generous. He was piss-poor at it, particularly in diffusing situations. By virtue of his personality, he'd never really practiced what you might call conflict resolution. For most of his life, he'd only given it a token effort and then quickly resorted to familiar violence. Except that wouldn't work out for him today. Today, he needed a silver tongue that he'd never learned to develop. Finally, Patrick's voice at full volume. All right, come on out! Hands up! And you better not have any weapons! Bran mumbled under his breath, I ain't got shit, and once again wished to all high heaven that Shay hadn't been so naive and idealistic. Who the hell tries to live in these times without a firearm? It was practically asking to get your shit pushed in. Bran sidled to the edge of the entrance, raising his hands above his head, palms open and facing out. Then he took one big step to his left and stood facing the forces arrayed against him. He'd already known there'd probably be a couple dozen given the amount of vehicles they'd heard rolling up, but he still felt his stomach drop at the sight of them. 20-some-odd number of men and women, their faces impassive masks that promised no quarter whatsoever, all of them armed with long guns. A few not too useful shotguns and deer rifles, but Bran was dismayed to see that the majority of them had assault weapons of some kind. For a moment, he wondered if they really had enough ammunition to fill all those high-capacity magazines, but then he realized it wouldn't make a difference. Even if they only had a handful of rounds per person, Bran and the 6 people hiding in the monastery were outnumbered 4-1. And with no guns of our own, which basically meant they were fucked, unless Bran could miraculously plead his case with such eloquence that they all decided to live and let live, pack it up and go home. Fat chance. He moved more or less to the center of the monastery's entrance, but stopped there. He could see Patrick directly across from him, the weed-infested gravel road running maybe 60 yards between them. Patrick had a rifle in his hands, held ready but not pointing at Bran. That was a small comfort, because every other rifle was. Bran thought he saw some irritation cross over Patrick's features. The man waved at him brusquely. "Walk towards us!" Bran shook his head and shouted back, "Not a chance, Patrick! I want to talk this out, but you're gonna have to meet me here! I'm not walking out into the open with 20 fucking guns pointed at my face!" This wasn't off to a great start. Patrick huffed and fidgeted, cast a few sidelong glances, and Bran followed his gaze, catching sight of a few people he hadn't seen before, people crouching just inside the wood line with scoped rifles trained on him. Yeah, he had Bran covered good and solid, which meant it didn't really make a difference whether they talked out in the open or right where Bran stood, because if shit went down, Bran had no doubt that those marksmen could perforate his brain before he had a chance to get to cover. Patrick must have figured the same thing because he started limping forward, apparently knowing that all the real danger was on Bran. As the man approached, Bran's mind ran in circles, trying to gather up a bunch of pretty words that seemed to flitter out of his reach like scraps of paper caught in the wind. Could Patrick even be reasoned with? Bran had tried the previous night, and nothing he'd said had broken through. The other man was just too caught up in his fear and hatred of the primals. But maybe that had been exacerbated by the fact that Khan had just killed his team and then come in to attack them where they hid in the monastery. Maybe Patrick had managed to cool off some overnight. Oddly, Bran found himself hoping that Patrick had got himself a good night's sleep and eaten a hearty meal before coming out. Anything that might help his mindset be a little more friendly. Although gathering up a war party and marching up to their doorstep seemed to imply a marked lack of amicability. Patrick stopped about 10 yards from Bran, apparently deciding that was close enough. Silence reigned. Bran needed to say something, but found himself suddenly and absolutely blank. He started to panic, started to sink back into old ways of thinking. Fuck this guy. Maybe you can grab him and take his gun away. Use him as a meat shield. Hold him hostage and force the others to retreat. Yeah, Bran was pretty shitty at conflict resolution. Patrick broke the silence. "It wasn't you I shot, was it?" Bran blinked a few times, the question taking him by surprise. "It wasn't Big Black either," Patrick continued, his eyes squinting, his expression somewhat vindicated now that he'd uncovered the lie. "It was that hybrid you've got in there with you. The big, dark-skinned one. In the moment, he looked like Big Black to me." Bran's mouth shuddered open and said the first thing that came to him. "His name's Elijah." Patrick made a face. "Now you're naming them? They're not fucking animals. Bullshit." Patrick took a step forward. "Big Black? He and his infected raided our settlement a few years back. Killed 11 people. Carried them off into the woods. We found their bodies later, eaten to the bones." Something horrific shimmered beneath Patrick's facade of control. "2 of those bodies were my daughters." Another step forward, his eyes flashing, nostrils flaring. "So tell me again how they're not fucking animals. I fucking dare you." Bran shook his head. "Elijah isn't like them. Neither is Kat, the girl you saw yesterday." "Girl," Patrick spat. "They're hybrids, not full-blooded primals, or infected or whatever. And how much infected genetics does it take for them to be animals in your mind?" Where's the dividing line there? Bran frowned at the other man. How much human has to be in them for you to think of them as people? Patrick snarled, flashing his teeth, somewhat like a primal himself in that moment. I've seen what they do! What's that? Bran shot back. Save your fucking ass? Because that's all you've seen these hybrids do. You were about to get torn to shreds. We all were. And we would have if it hadn't been for Elijah and Kat coming in to save us. That's your only experience with these hybrids. And you're gonna repay them by coming back and... what? What's your plan here, Patrick? Patrick seemed a bit taken aback, and Bran momentarily felt exultant. Had he actually managed to say some good words? Was Patrick finally hearing him? But then Patrick's face returned to its snarling rage. You can't raise and shelter infected in our backyard! They're dangerous! Bran threw his hands out, exasperated. I've been here for weeks. They're not fucking dangerous. Yeah? Who's Elijah's father? Huh? Patrick shook his head, a savage smile coming to his lips as he saw the truth written all over Bran's face. He'd never been a good poker player. Because I'll be damned if that hybrid of yours doesn't look exactly like Big Black. Bran thought about admitting the truth, but what was the point? He knew what Patrick would say to that. He knew what Patrick would believe. And it was the same thing that Shay believed, that the sins of the father extended to the guilt of the son. The Khan's seed was still lurking inside of them, waiting to germinate into something terrible and brutal and animalistic. Instead, Bran chose to point to a different truth. And what was Elijah doing when you shot him on the side of that road? Patrick's face flashed triumph. So it was him that I shot. Yeah, it was him that you shot, Bran snapped. And he knew that you'd shot him and he still came to your rescue, even though you shot him for no fucking reason. Isn't that right? What was he doing, Patrick? What was he doing on the side of that road? Snarling and attacking? Or was he just sitting there watching the cars go by because he was curious? Patrick drew himself up. It's not my job to wait for the infected to be a threat. It's my job to hunt them and put them down before they become a threat. And that's what I'm doing here. Eliminating the fucking problem before it grows too big to handle. Or should I wait until they slaughter someone else's family before I do what I knew all along needed to be done? Patrick shook his head fervently. You should know better, Bran. You and Shay should both know better. Hell, you're probably the first ones they're going to turn on. Then, abruptly, Patrick coughed out a laugh and pointed at Bran. You know what you remind me of? He didn't wait for Bran's answer. You remind me of this asshole that used to think he had a special connection with grizzly bears. Said we just didn't understand them. Said they could be trusted. The mirth fell away from Patrick's face. They found his remains in a pile of bear shit. And that's where you're headed, Bran. So how about you pull your head out of your ass, get Shay, and come out here? We'll handle the rest. You don't even have to watch. Bran was so mad his hands were shaking. I'm not letting you kill those kids. Oh, now they're kids? They're only a few fucking years old. Surprisingly, Patrick nodded, and for a moment, Bran wondered if that had done the trick. But then Patrick said this, and that's probably the only reason they haven't turned on you yet. Also, this conversation is going nowhere. You've got exactly 1 minute before I send everyone in, guns blazing. If you don't want to get shot down with the rest of them, this is your last chance to get Shay and get out. Judd Partlow crouched just inside the woods, his big 6.5 Creedmoor bolt action braced against the side of a tree. It wasn't a hunting rifle. Back before the plague hit, Judd had been into long-range shooting. This rifle was his precision rig, and with it, he could hit a golf ball at 500 yards. Because it was designed for precision, it was a heavy bastard, and Judd fervently wished he could pop the bipod and go prone with it, but there was too much low-lying brush that would cloud his vision if he did. Through the scope, his slightly straining arms were causing the reticle to tremble a bit, the crosshairs making little jittery circles around the nose of the man named Bran. He kept his finger off the trigger because it was dialed light, only 8 ounces, and would go off with a light touch. Judd had been the leader of the security team that had driven Patrick out to where the caravan had been demolished the previous evening. He'd traded a few harsh words with Patrick before he'd gone off on his ill-fated tracking mission with the remains of his team. Frankly, he didn't like Patrick much, but despite all that, when he'd heard the call for backup on the radio, Judd had immediately responded with his security team. And despite his dislike of the man, when they'd picked a wounded and harried Patrick up on the side of that road, and Patrick had told them what was hiding out in these woods, Judd had put his personal issues aside and assembled this little strike team to handle the problem. Judd might not see eye to eye with Patrick on much, but on this they could agree. If someone was harboring infected, whether they were somehow hybrids or not, then they needed to be stopped immediately, and the creatures they were keeping needed to be exterminated. It was a matter of life and death. It was a matter of survival. As Judd crouched there, straining to keep his sight steady on his target, he spotted movement. From his current vantage point, kicked far out to the right of their firing line, Judd could see through the arched entrance to the monastery, straight to a pair of big wooden doors that looked like they opened into some sort of chapel or sanctuary. In his view, those doors hovered just over Bran's right shoulder, and since he was sighting for Bran's face, it wasn't hard to notice that one of those big doors had just opened a few inches. Judd didn't immediately shift his aim, but his focus flicked to the door when it moved. At first, only shadows were visible through that partially opened door, and then a face. And that's when Judd did shift his aim, with a suddenly thundering pulse and a catching of his breath, because the face peering out from around that door was not human. He'd thought it was at first glance. Pretty auburn hair and surprisingly arresting eyes, but everything below that had been mutated by infected genetics. Holy shit, Judd thought. They really are hybrids. He realized that up until that specific moment, he hadn't really believed Patrick. It had been dark, and Patrick had been injured and probably out of his mind after losing his entire team, so he'd figured Patrick had just seen regular old infected that had somehow been tamed enough to have some human affectations. But no, what he was looking at now was clearly a mixed breed. Over the blood roaring in his ears, Judd could just make out Patrick's irritable words to Bran. He was telling him that he only had 1 minute before they went in and wiped the whole settlement out. Judd shifted his reticle to the malformed face peeking out from around the door. He had a bead on what was clearly one of the hybrids they needed to eliminate, and Judd might not get such an easy, clear shot again. So, despite the fact that Patrick had given Bran 1 minute to get his shit together, Judd figured he'd be forgiven for starting the party a little early. His finger dropped to the trigger, just barely touching it. He forced his locked-up lungs to start breathing again, refreshed them, then slowly breathed out, adding pressure to the trigger ounce by ounce. Then something fell on him. His big rifle discharged into the dirt as it was smacked out of his grip so suddenly that it left Judd's hands buzzing. Something rammed his face into the ground, smashing his mouth against an exposed root. He felt his own teeth pepper the back of his throat, tasted copper, tried to scream but couldn't. Then he was ripped onto his back by hands that felt as unstoppable as a force of nature. Judd looked up, coughing out teeth and blood, and caught just the barest glimpse of a massive black-skinned creature with a mane of dreadlocks and a too large mouth filled with too large teeth. Terror. It's Big Black. Then Judd had a very strange experience. It was the first and last time he would experience such a thing, and he actually marveled at it in his final, fleeting moments. Judd Partlow remained conscious for roughly 3 full seconds after his head had been ripped from his body. Chapter 18. A lot happened for Patrick in the span of just a few blazingly confusing moments. He was standing there, facing down the man named Bran, giving him his final ultimatum, and then there was a gunshot. Patrick's immediate instinct was to snap his lever action up at Bran's chest, but right about the time that he got the rifle levered, he realized the gunshot had come from behind him. Even then, Patrick might have stayed locked on to Bran, except that he saw Bran's eyes rocket so wide they seemed to take up his entire face. In those eyes was no trickery, only abject fear. And there's just something highly motivating about someone looking over your shoulder, clearly on the verge of pissing their pants. Without thinking, Patrick spun. As soon as he did, the thought occurred to him, Bran's going to tackle you from behind. But before he could turn back around, he was arrested by the sight that met his eyes, and any confusion was blasted away by the sudden thunder roll of nearly every rifle in his group opening up at once. Except they weren't firing at the monastery. Everyone was facing the wrong way, facing the woods. Shapes burst from the undergrowth. In a single instant, Patrick watched no less than 6 of his group go down as the mutated bodies of sinewy, long-limbed infected tackled them. And more kept coming, pouring out of the woodline now. A dozen, then 2 dozen. A chorus of screams started up. Blood and body parts started flying. Patrick's entire group, those that remained standing anyways, broke and started sprinting for the monastery. 2 people had the wherewithal to slide into the driver's seat of a pair of vehicles. Infected swarmed after them as the tires skidded up plumes of dirt, their muscular bodies flying through the air, carried on massive, inhuman leaps, and landing on the roofs and hoods of the vehicles as they surged forward, straight at Patrick. Oh shit! Patrick spun, and realized that Bran had made a break for it. He was already halfway to a pair of big wooden doors, sprinting quite fast for a middle-aged man. On instinct, Patrick sighted for Bran's back, but didn't pull the trigger. Fuck that shit. He needed to run. He hauled after Bran as one of the 2 vehicles swerved and slammed into the side of the monastery's entrance, sending 2 infected catapulting off amid an explosion of pulverized adobe. One of the infected went tumbling to the ground right in Patrick's path. It seemed not to have even been dazed by the impact, and immediately thrashed to its feet again, long hair flying, feral eyes darting wildly, mouthful of teeth gaping. Patrick snapshot it at less than 5 yards, that big 45-70 round turning the creature's face inside out. Now, suddenly in an entirely different position, Patrick's demanding tone fled him and he screamed out plaintively, "Bran, wait!" But Bran didn't wait. He hit those big wooden doors and disappeared inside, and Patrick was only a few more sprinting strides away when those doors slammed shut, locking Patrick outside with the infected. At every step, Bran wondered why in the fuck Patrick hadn't shot him in the back. Then Bran heard the other man's cry, how his tone had changed from one who has the upper hand to one who has suddenly found themselves in dire straits. Bran didn't even have the gumption to feel vindicated. He was just as terrified as Patrick sounded, and that left little room for anything else but survival. He saw Kat's face ahead of him, peeking out of the open sanctuary door. She saw him coming and slipped out of his way, pushing the door open for him. He burst through and immediately spun, Kat right at his shoulder, knowing what he intended to do. They slammed the door, practically right in Patrick's face. The sanctuary doors were equipped only with old latch and handle hardware, no lock. Bran and Kat both immediately seized one of the handles on either side of the double doors, pulling backward just as Patrick rammed into the door on the other side and started yanking manically as he screamed, "Let me the fuck in!" Another shout hit Bran from behind. Shay's voice fear-shrilled. "What the fuck is going on out there?" The 2 handles. Bran could stick something through them to hold the door shut. He whipped his head around as the handle rattled in his grip, Patrick trying mightily to overpower the 2 of them and gain access to the sanctuary. Shay hunched halfway behind a pew, her eyes wild, her hands up as though to protect her face as wayward bullets scudded through the sanctuary's windows. No glass in those windows, only a slim metal grate that Bran didn't think would hold for very long if a primal got to tugging on it. He figured the grates were to keep wildlife out of the open windows, but not this kind of wildlife. Shouts and cries and snarls poured in through those glassless windows, along with a constant stream of hectic gunshots. "Find me something to brace the doors with!" Bran yelled at Shay or her boys, whoever would listen and react first. The boys, every single one of them, immediately sprang into action, searching for anything they could stick through the handles. Shay didn't move from her spot. "Bran, what the—" "It's Khan!" Bran roared at her. "He's here with his whole pack!" Despite a fresh flurry of bullets ripping through the windows behind her and sending up gouts of adobe dust, Shay froze, looking all the more still because of the movement all around her. Her boys scrambled about, looking for a pipe or a broom or anything. Elijah leapt to the back of the stage, ducking under the gunfire that rattled across the simple iron cross that adorned the far wall. A gunshot rocked the other side of the doors, the racking sound of Patrick's lever-action rifle, immediately followed by another teeth-jangling blast. "Bran!" Kat this time, giving him a hard shoulder check to get his attention. Bran held his gaze on Elijah for just long enough to see him leap onto the cross, grab the top, brace his feet on the wall, and wrench backwards as though he were performing a horizontal deadlift. Bran snapped his eyes to Kat as he heard the sound of the cross's mountings popping loose of the wall. "What?" Kat was still holding the door shut with all her considerable might, but she nodded at the door, not looking strained at all.
Let him in!
As though he'd heard that, Patrick fired 2 more rapid shots, then started kicking the door and shrieking the most contradictory diatribe Bran had ever heard.
Please, you motherfucker! Don't leave me out here! Help me, goddammit, you fucking...
But it was the look in Kat's eyes, rather than Patrick's words, that caved Bran's will. She was stern and confident, and somehow also pleading. Of all the damn times to decide to feel compassion, she picked now. But if Kat was going to experience that most unique of human emotions, Bran wasn't going to be the one to tell her no. Besides, he had an inkling that he'd feel pretty damn bad if he heard Patrick getting torn up on the other side of that door. Fuck the guy, but he was still a human being, and he didn't deserve to go out like that, even if he was an asshole. After all, Bran had been an asshole too, and been shown unbelievable mercy by people that should have executed him on the spot, which was the only reason those 2 gunshots to his torso had turned to scars instead of turning him into a corpse. He shoved the door open. Patrick came flying in as though he'd just been charging the door afresh. He went sprawling onto the center aisle, his rifle clattering across the ground. Elijah, lugging the iron cross, nimbly hurdled Patrick's falling form. Bran yanked the door shut again, catching the barest glimpse of the wild chaos without. Steam pouring from the crumpled hood of a pickup truck that had bashed itself into the front entrance of the monastery, people sprinting every which way, naked, inhuman bodies tearing after them on all fours, tackling them, ripping pieces off of them amid the hair-raising chorus of their death wails. The second the 2 door handles aligned, Elijah was there, ramming the base of the cross straight through them and barring the door. Bran's peripheral caught Kat flying away from the door. He backpedaled, hoping to God, whose house this purportedly was, that the cross would hold. Surely, if such a being actually existed, he wouldn't let them get slaughtered in his house. He turned in time to see Kat land on Patrick's back and wondered in that split second if he'd read Kat entirely wrong. Maybe she just wanted to be the one to part his trachea from his body. "Kat!" Bran yelled at her, not sure if he wanted to stop her or encourage her. Patrick scrambled for his rifle, yowling like an animal, but Kat grabbed that reaching arm of his, halting it. Despite the size difference between apparently teenage woman and full-grown man, Kat yanked him onto his back with a casual sort of ease. Patrick tried to reach his left hand across his body for the pistol on his right hip, but Kat mounted him high on his chest, pinning his arms with her knees and then seizing his throat. Yup, she just wanted to rip his throat out. And then, she didn't. She leaned into Patrick's face, her claw-tipped fingers drawing beads of blood from his neck as she pulled his head up so they were practically nose to nose. For his part, Patrick didn't cower. Strangled noises of defiance seethed through his bared teeth, his eyes full of hatred.
Mercy,
Kat rasped into his face.
From my human side.
Patrick's snarling mouth slackened, his baleful gaze flickering out, replaced with disbelief. Kat released her grip on his neck and his head fell back, still looking stunned. She reached behind her to his right hip, liberating his pistol, then rose from atop him and snatched up his rifle as well. Patrick wasted no time scrambling to his feet. He stood there, eyes darting about, seeing all the hybrids that now surrounded him. Something slammed into the door behind Bran, making him jump and twist to look. The doors rattled violently, something on the other side trying to get in. A human or a primal? If it was a human, should he open the door and let them in? A rasping snarl from the other side of the thick wood answered that question. Bran backpedaled from the door, worrying about the cross, but the iron was thick and sturdy and it wouldn't be broken. The flimsy grates over the windows, though. Bran turned back to Patrick again, registering that the gunshots from outside had become pathetically sporadic. He found himself hoping that some of those people, even if they had come to kill these hybrids, had found places to hide or simply managed to get away and flee into the woods. "What now?" Patrick husked, turning in a slow circle, as though he felt the need to not have his back to any of the hybrids, though that was impossible. They were all around him. Bran stalked towards him as the doors continued to rattle behind him. Patrick saw him coming and raised his hands defensively, but Bran was in no mood for bullshit. Something was happening inside of him, and for a moment he thought it was that old, familiar feeling of animal ferocity coming over him. He batted Patrick's hands out of the way and snatched him up by the collar in one smooth, rapid movement, pulling the other man into his own snarling face. Yes, he was mad. Yes, he was feeling ferocity come over him. But it wasn't the same. This wasn't dark mode, he realized, because all those other times he'd gone to that savage place in his mind, it had been for his own pride, to prove something, to show how little he cared, to show how crazy he could be if you pushed him too far. It had always been about him. But the violence boiling up inside of him now, it wasn't about him this time. This violence was for someone else. This was for Kat and Shay and her boys. This violence didn't want to prove anything to anyone. It only wanted the ones that he cared for to be safe. "What now?" Bran hissed in Patrick's face. "Now I kill you because you're an ignorant fuck and a threat to my family. Or you look around at the faces of the people that you were so goddamn convinced were animals and you see the humanity in them. And then you swear to me on the memory of your daughters that you won't try to take them from me. And then maybe we can turn our attention to taking down the bastard that killed your family and is trying to kill mine." The two men stared at each other for a moment, nostrils flaring, breath huffing in each other's face. Then Patrick's eyes flicked off to the side, saw Kat, the one that had every right to kill him but had chosen to show mercy instead, and little Jacob, standing there looking lost and bewildered. And Elijah, who he'd shot, not because he'd done anything wrong, but simply because he looked like his father. Back to Bran. Patrick nodded. "I swear it." Bran detached himself from the man and looked at Kat. "Give me the pistol. Give him his rifle."
What?
Shay exploded.
You can't give him a fucking gun! He'll kill us!
Kat handed the pistol to Bran, but hesitated with the rifle, glancing between him and Shay. Bran checked the magazine and chamber, fully loaded. Then, rather than look at Shay, he fixed Patrick again with a stern gaze. "No, he swore on his family, and if he's any more human than the creatures he hunts, he won't break that promise." Patrick's jaw clenched, but he nodded and held his hand out for the rifle. "I won't." Bran jerked his head at Kat. "Give him the rifle." Patrick got his hands on the thing and clutched it covetously, then shouldered it and spun towards the door. Bran brushed past him. "The door will hold, but these windows won't." Bran was moving towards the stage, a little recessed nook, the furthest away from the windows you could get and still be in the sanctuary. He realized that he wasn't hearing anything from outside now. It made him pause for a moment in his steps, quirking his head to listen. But outside the sanctuary was only the silence of the dead, and the silence of predators stalking. "Everyone on the stage," Bran said, his voice going low, not wanting to be overly loud, though really, he was pretty sure the primals knew exactly where they were. A brief moment of ridiculous hope. Maybe they'll leave us alone. He almost laughed at himself. If this were any other pack of primals that were simply on the hunt, that might have been a reasonable hope, that they'd take what they'd already killed and not waste the energy cracking their defenses open to get a few more. But this wasn't any other pack of primals. This was Khan. This was Big Black. Shay bounded up to him.
Do you have some sort of plan?
He stepped up onto the shallow stage, stopped and looked at her. "We're all gonna fight, or we're all gonna die." She blinked at him.
My boys.
"If you want your boys to live, you gotta let them fight. There's not another option now. And if we make it to tomorrow and you want me gone, then I'll understand. But..." He stopped when Shay spun away from him, seemed to be looking for something for a moment, then charged across the stage to a big iron candle stand. She snatched it up. It was about 4 feet long, a single thick candle on the top, spiked to a wide base to catch the dripping wax. Then, with surprising energy, she swung the candle stand down on the ground. The candle went flying off, as did the saucer-shaped base, leaving a gnarled tip that wasn't really all that sharp, but Bran had no doubt that Shay could impale something with it if she got her dander up. When she turned and looked at him again, still holding the makeshift spear, her eyes told him she had all the dander she needed. She was a gentle creature, not given to violence, not like Bran. But even gentle creatures can do a hell of a lot of damage when their children are threatened. Patrick mounted the stage, rifle shouldered, eyeing the layout of the sanctuary with a strategic eye. "We should pile the pews up, give them barriers to go over. Slow them down so we can make our shots count. Bran glanced at him. How many rounds you got for that thing?
12.
The pistol in Bran's hand had a full 15-round magazine, and one in the chamber. The math was unforgiving. The only way they made it out of this alive was if they landed every single shot and made a mortal wound with each. And frankly, Bran didn't see that happening. Maybe for Patrick, if he was a deadeye with that lever action. But Bran held no illusions that he was any sort of gunslinger. No one had asked them to, but the boys had all heard Patrick's idea about the pews and were already dragging as many as they could forward, closing the gap of the aisle and creating concentric rings around the stage, over which the primals would have to leap and clamber, which they could do quite easily. But even though the meager barricades would only slow them a little, Bran would take every advantage he could get. Kat bounded onto the stage with him. She had a look about her that Bran didn't like. Didn't like it because, hell, she almost seemed excited, like this was somehow the best day of her life. Serious, too, of course. She wasn't so naive as to brush off the reality that they all might die. But Kat was a being for which violence came naturally, and acting normal was a strain. To have that strain of social expectations lifted from her made her look loose and free and, damn it, happy.
1 bullet,
she said,
in each, to slow them down. Me and the boys, we'll clean up.
Bran cocked an eyebrow, then exchanged a glance with Patrick. Patrick seemed a bit surprised to hear a logical, strategic thought process come from Kat, but then he shrugged. Good a plan as any. They turned out to the sanctuary. No more rattling at the doors. Shad and Mish dropped the last pew in place with a heavy wooden clunk, and then everything was electrically charged silence. Boys, Bran whispered, putting both hands on the pistol now. Get behind us. With almost frightening quiet,